Hey, welcome to the Treehouse Athenaeum. We're really excited you could join us today. Take a seat or maybe a walk as we jump into some topics you probably wondered about. From deciphering dreams to following your wildest intuitive hits, we've definitely got something for you. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Treehouse Athenaeum podcast. Today I'm here with Lisa, and we're going to talk a little bit about her start in Enneagram.
Yay! I'm so excited. And I'm excited to be here with you, Daniela, because you are one of the people that I have learned about the Enneagram alongside.
Yes. And I've been thinking about this all day. We've been friends for a while, but this is kind of what reconnected us and kept us connected through your move, too.
Yeah.
And I sort of, but not really have Christina to thank for that, because I think about that last dinner that we had.
Yeah.
Was that at Gators or something? Yeah. And then that's when I was like, wait, you're into the Enneagram? And that was like it. So yay. Thank you, Christina.
Thanks, Christina.
So Enneagram quite properly changed my life. And I feel like anyone that has come to terms with the Enneagram, because I feel like people have different opinions or maybe feelings towards how it affected their life. I feel like if you are someone who values awareness, self-awareness, introspection, these things, then the Enneagram also probably changed your life. So I don't think it gets enough attention, though, and I think it gets written off a lot. So for anyone that doesn't know about the Enneagram, can you give us like a basic rundown of what it is?
Yes. So the Enneagram is 9 different lenses through which different people see the world. The term Enneagram is actually Greek, which is my little tie-in to the Athenaeum. Ennea comes from the word, or it's Greek for 9, and gram is a shorter version of gramos, which means figure. So translated, Enneagram means 9-pointed figure, which sounds like geometry class. And I try not to think about geometry too much in my life, but this is the exception to the rule. So the Enneagram assumes that you are a whole person, right? But within you, you have one core type, and that type has a core desire. And on the flip side of that coin, there is a core fear. And then personality comes as a part of that, but that's kind of your North Star at the middle of where you're at. It's like the root cause of why you are the way that you are. And it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, when I looked at it as this is what's motivating people's behavior and their actions, I felt more empathy for people after realizing that, maybe someone is just trying to protect that little kid who learned that this is the way the world works. And so as adults, we have to unlearn, sort of. The world doesn't work in that one singular way.
Yeah.
So when did you find out about the Enneagram, and is that the main thing that stuck out to you, or did more kind of hit you in the face as Enneagram does?
I originally heard about it when I was in this era of my life where all I wanted to do was listen to podcasts hosted by former Bachelor contestants. And this one was one that I adored, Caitlin Bristow. And the reason that I adore her is because she is just at the risk of sounding very cliche, she's so real, but she really is. And I like the topics that she was covering, and she just had this kind of gregarious personality that I could relate to. And she brought a guest on, I want to say this was like 2014, that was talking about the Enneagram. And that was the first that I'd heard of it. And Caitlin was describing how seen she felt by it. And she mentioned that she was a 3. And I was like, hang on. Everything that she is saying, I relate deeply to. So am I thinking this because I just really like Caitlin and I want to be like her? Or am I thinking that because I'm also a 3? Like, I thought this is just how everybody lives, jumping from one success to the next. And it turns out that's not it. So I took the test. And I read about the 9 types, and sure enough, I was a 3. So no wonder I was connecting to her so much.
Yep.
And I really like just about anything that I get excited about, I fell down the deepest rabbit hole learning about it. Of course, I wanted to learn about my type first and what made me me, because I'm a human and humans like to hear about themselves. And then I started learning about the other 8 types in addition to my own for a few different reasons. One of them being that I wanted to relate to the people around me, because I was realizing not everybody operated the same way that I did. Not everybody was trying to, protect the same little kernel of fear in their chest that I was.
Yes.
And that was a game changer for me. So I decided to continue studying it for funsies for a while. And then in grad school, I had a professor that really encouraged me to keep expanding on it. And I did a project where I identified what I thought each of the main cast of Parks and Rec would be by Enneatype. And then I talked about their motivations. And then I ended up doing my thesis on it. So that's when I jumped into a ton of research on it. And I was showing you before, I found my copy of The Wisdom of the Enneagram by Riso and Hudson. And this is the book. This is like modern Enneagram. It's been around for thousands of years, but this is like the reinvented version that's a lot more accessible to today's life. And it's just full. It's full of sticky notes. And all of this is stuff that I had to write as like a parking lot item. And what I mean by parking lot item is when you research a thesis for grad school, you end up going down so many different roads. You're like, that would be so cool to learn about. And that would be so cool to learn about.
Yeah.
And that would be so cool to learn about. But you can't learn about all of it because you need to condense it. So I kept coming back to it over and over again. And then I started giving lectures on it to my friends during COVID virtually. And that was something that everybody would show up for all of a sudden. Like I would be talking to 1 or 2 people about it, other people would hear, and all of a sudden there were like 40 people listening to me talk about the Enneagram.
I would have died. I wish I would have. I didn't know. I was learning about Enneagram at the same time, so I would have just like died. Anyway, sorry. Continue.
No, I mean, we've talked about everything that I talked about in there one-on-one. Yeah. So I feel like you got the meteor experience.
Oh, I got the one-on-one. Yeah, I like it. Okay.
You got that support. Yeah, but then I ended up to just, I figured if I like it so much, why don't I marry it? So I went ahead and got certified. And here we are.
Yes. The Enneagram, I can see exactly why you had 40 people on your Zoom being like, tell me more, because you're right. People do love to hear about themselves. People like to understand what makes them tick, especially from a different perspective, and especially from you, because I feel like you deliver things so well and you already had experience in coaching. So I feel like Enneagram and coaching kind of go hand in hand, but can you explain why they go hand in hand and why it's such a little perfect marriage?
Yes, thank you. So I have a lot of philosophies as a coach, and I will probably start a lot of sentences with my philosophy as a coach is, this is one of them, that you cannot make change unless you figure out what the root cause is for that change. So if somebody comes to me and they say, okay, Lisa, I want to open a new business and I want to do it by the end of March, I will immediately start saying, okay, what kind of business? What are you trying to deliver with it? Why is this important to you? And I feel like I end up sounding like a toddler pretty often because I'll be like, well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Over and over and over again until you get to it. But unless you can figure out what the why is, you're never going to get anywhere. It's going to be Band-Aids. So you need 100%. To be able to understand where someone is coming from. And Enneagram is a shortcut for that. that doesn't mean that it like solves everything right away, but it makes everything a hell of a lot easier. So when I work with my Enneagram clients specifically, we start with a deep dive. And I talk about, okay, this is what you tested as. This is what this means. Here's this concept. How have you seen it connect into your life? And then you start watching the light bulbs go off. And then all of a sudden, what you're doing is you're gaining a vocabulary for why you are the way that you are. And it all comes back to whatever it is that you're trying to protect.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen it in you, Daniela, is you've talked your way through different life experiences. We've been friends for a while, as you said earlier, and a lot of it comes back to you want to do the right thing. You want to do you want to do good. You want to do well, and that's the core desire of a 1. And so, as a 1, you want to be perfect. You want to be good. As a 3, I want to be valued. I want to be the best at things. So we present very similarly. Because we would both want perfection,
right.
But I would want it because it makes it look better and it's the full package, but I'm more likely to take shortcuts. Whereas you want to make sure that like if somebody comes in and audits you, that you have an answer for every little thing.
Yeah, 100%. And I had a hard time initially when I first took the assessment because I thought I was going to be a 3. And I didn't understand, or I didn't fully connect that winning at something is sort of the byproduct of, being a perfectionist. And I get so I think of in undergrad, we had to we were given like, fictitiously given a plot of land and we had to develop on it. I went to undergrad for tourism. So we were like, okay, here's your plot of land, go develop it, give us your whole business plan and the whole, all of that. I think we had the best plan. And I understand that I'm biased, but I really think our group had the best plan. And the group that won just had the flashiest plan. And I was so upset by it because their model didn't make any sense. So okay, first of all, let's sidebar into this really quick. Their plan, so it was, I don't remember exactly how big the plot of land was, but they wanted to put a cruise ship on land and that be the destination. Where we had kind of proposed a mixed use kind of like, so also relevant for context, this plot of land is in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, because I went to undergrad at Coastal Carolina, but Myrtle Beach is kind of disconnected from, I don't know, it's like a little bit stuck in time. Not like super far back in time, but it doesn't have things like the Cheesecake Factory or like, like there wasn't any. I know. So we were like, let's design a mixed use space and we're going to bring in all these things that are like commodities from other cities. And we're also going to have a park because there's not a lot of green space. And, like it's like a block from the beach. So we wanted to like benefit what people were already asking for in the space. Whereas I feel like this other group just brought this like really cheesy, I don't know, ill-planned, like big ass thing. And their plan was just, it was not as nonsensical as a cruise ship on land. So I was just like, oh my God, but it won. And I was pissed. But in that moment, I should have realized and reflecting on the Enneagram that like, okay, yeah, I'm a 1. Because if I were a 3, I would have been like, good for them. Maybe that's wrong. But I know that I had such a strong sense of like, this isn't right. This is not, if you go through the rubric, you're going to tell me that our plan really was worse. So yeah, it's just, but then I saw the difference too with 5s because I thought too, maybe I could be a 5, but as you can explain, 5's core desire is to be competent. And really competency is just a tool for perfection. So like I just saw, the things working.
Well, there's a lot of interconnectedness. And that's a really important thing to remember when you're working with the Enneagram is that you're not relegated to being in your one little box. The point is, it's showing you how you've already done that to yourself, and then it gives you the tools to get out of that box. So with any number, any type, you're going to have access to the behaviors of your core type, the types on either side of your core type, which are called your wings. And then you have access to an arrow that points to the type whose behaviors you take on in times of stress, and the type whose behaviors you take on in times of growth. And so that's 5 out of 9. So actually taking on traits of the numbers that you don't have access to naturally is a really good tool for growth. And that's kind of the goal, is figuring out how you can look at life through so many different lenses rather than the one that you've kind of subconsciously been gravitating towards forever, because it's what feels safe to you. And of course, we all deserve a sense of safety. And of course, we're going to see things in other types that make sense to us. For example, the core desire of a 7 is to be happy, and their fear is of being trapped in pain. Well, obviously, all of us want to be happy, right?
Yeah.
But like listening to your story about the tourism project, it sounds like a 7 could have made that cruise ship, because it's flashy.
Probably.
It sounds fun. It's big picture. But where are the little details that go into it? They're in the rubric. So was that team looking in the rubric? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I don't know what their type was. It's impossible to tell just from that. But what it is possible to tell is why it irked you the way that it did when you took the time to make sure you were going through and hitting the check boxes, doing something realistic that you could maybe apply later and still felt appealing to a crowd, because that's a big part of tourism.
Yeah. Also, like what you were saying about the growth arrow, makes so much sense. And I am not as familiar about everyone's growth arrow, but I know mine, because it's something that I feel like even before I knew about the Enneagram, I've been it has been a struggle for me. So one's growth arrow goes into 7. So obviously, if I'm, so stuck on being a perfectionist and making sure I'm doing the right thing, that sounds so serious and it sounds so bogged down. And it's true, I do get kind of bogged down in these little things sometimes. And so my entire life, some people have always been telling me, lighten up. And I'm like, how? And so for 7 being the growth arrow for a 1 makes so much sense. And I feel like it's poetic in a way. You need to incorporate some of a little bit of what's opposite to kind of balance you out, and also to achieve some kind of like joy, or I mean, for me it's literal, right? Like happiness, but to just kind of balance you, like all of your focus in being a 1 is it's making you heavier. Maybe you need a little bit of lightness. So I don't know. I that makes sense to me. Like it's very well thought out.
I agree. And I think it's easy to focus in on the things that you feel are negative about your own number, because when you first learn about the Enneagram, you feel dragged, so dragged. I know that I felt like somebody had lifted up my childhood mattress and pulled out my little diary, and then they handed it to my sister, and she was like, yelling on a megaphone about it. My sister really has nothing to do with this, but she's the only other one who knew where my childhood diary was hidden. And it is, there's a large amount of discomfort that goes into that. However, being a 1 doesn't necessarily mean that you're stuck in the details for boring things all the time. It's not like you're just weeding through mountains of paperwork for fun. And the example that I can think of for that is my mom is also a 1, and my mom is an incredibly creative human. And one of the things that she does that is so creative and fun and kind of notorious within our neighborhood is she used to every year make different scarecrows for Halloween, but they weren't your typical scarecrow. It was kind of like the Calvin and Hobbes style snowman, if you ever read that.
Yeah.
It was always telling some sort of story. So there was one year where she had a scarecrow of a little girl on the rooftop dangling a spider down in front of someone else that looked shocked. And everybody thought that scarecrow was me on the roof. And it's because she put so much attention to detail in it. Like, she doesn't just settle for things. Like, when she commits to a bit, she commits to a bit. And that's something that I really appreciate about Once, because that's something that I've watched from her and I've picked up from her, even though I take it in my different, little spinny way. But the details do make a difference. And I appreciate the fact that Ones want to make sure that they have those perfect finishing touches, because sometimes that really does make all the difference.
Yeah. I mean, to me that seems obvious, but I think I can think back on similar experiences where people are like, wow, you really put a lot of thought into this. And
Yeah.
to me, yes, I did, but it also wasn't like it wasn't a hard lift to put thought into that thing. It's
Well,
just
exactly.
ingrained.
Exactly. It's ingrained. It's something that it's just a little itch in your brain that you have to scratch. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So loving the Enneagram as much as we do.
Mhm.
And I feel like championing, especially on my side of the world, where I feel like I talk about Enneagram literally all the time. And I'm sure my friends are tired of hearing it because everything kind of comes back because and maybe not to Enneagram. I think Enneagram is just the tool, but everything comes back to that core motivation for me. And so I find that I pull on Enneagram a lot because it's just the easiest tool to discuss. And like you said, give the language for that core motivation, core fear. And so when I'm psychoanalyzing people, as I do for fun with my friends, I feel like I rely on the Enneagram. Maybe not, I mean, I expressly name the Enneagram, but even if I were to pull back on the use of the term Enneagram, I would still be using the language of the Enneagram to talk about that. So, with being such a staunch supporter, what do you say to people who write off the Enneagram and label it a personality test?
I firmly say that's not true. I've gotten a lot better about rating myself in, but it's not a personality test. You can have two people of the same type that are completely different, but they're going to be motivated by the same thing. And I feel like I'm really picking on Ones, but the example that I typically use is, I'm not saying that either of these people are Ones, but just roll with it. Let's say that you have Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, is both are Ones, right? And they're trying to live by their internal values. It's the same thing that they're doing. They're both saying, like, this is the way it should be. I know the rule book. We're going to do it this way. But clearly, those two men are very diametrically opposed. And so they're both going to be firm in their belief that their value is correct. So you can have so many different flavors of the same point of view, which is why I say it's 9 different lenses through which you see the world. And it's not personal. Like, yes, personality comes into it, but it's personality that's born of what are you trying to protect on the inside. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because if you have someone that is sick because they have chicken pox, okay, you're not going to prescribe them Benadryl. Just because they're itchy doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to prescribe them the normal thing for itchy people, because it's a different thing. It's a different strain. It's a different cause right at the root. And I'm realizing that chickenpox might be kind of a weird example, since our generation was the first to get vaccinated for it. I don't think chickenpox happens anymore, at least not frequently. Yeah. But anyway, it's the same thing here. If I'm trying to troubleshoot a problem with you, versus trying to troubleshoot a problem with, let's say, like Jenny, who's a totally different type than you are. I'm going to approach it two different ways because there needs to be that approach. And whether or not you consciously recognize that's what I'm doing, it doesn't really matter, because the point is your subconscious does recognize it and your subconscious does react to it. And it's just, it's this way of seeing other people and letting them see you. And it makes all the difference in interpersonal communications. It really does.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's probably, other than self-awareness and really getting to know, who I am and what drives me, I would say the second biggest thing is that it really like did wonders for relationships
Mhm.
because of that, because you suddenly get the other person in a way that maybe you overlooked before, or you maybe were putting pieces together, but again, it's like that final puzzle piece of like, oh, I understand this person now. And it makes you kind of approach situations a little bit differently. Maybe they don't see how this thing is affecting this particular problem that they're just like banging their head against the wall about. And you all of a sudden have this missing piece, unlocks everything. But in that same thing, you know as an extension of this whole like, oh, it's just some dumb personality test, what do you say to people who think it's limiting?
That they need to take a closer look. Truly. A lot of folks do say it's limiting immediately when,
Mhm.
because it does get lumped in with the personality test, like mild shades of Myers-Briggs. But if you tell me that you're an INTPJ, it's going to take me a hot minute to decipher all of that and figure out what that means. And even then, it's just, I get what the letters mean, but I don't know how that means you want to be communicated with. I don't know what that means about how you like to be loved. I
Mhm.
know essentially that it means that you either need to recharge energy around other people, or you need to recharge energy by yourself, the extroversion versus introversion, or that you sense more than you perceive, which hints at the idea of using your brain as a processing center as a final check rather than your heart as a processing center. But the Enneagram has answers for all that. Each of the types is split into one of three processing centers. So types 8, 9, and 1 all use their gut as a final check. Types 2, 3, and 4 all use their heart as a final check. And types 5, 6, and 7 all use logic, their brain, as a final check. So if you go to a 4 who's in the heart center and you're like, well, how does this make you feel? That's not always the most helpful thing because they've already been sitting in their feelings on that. You need to switch up their brain and have them look into a different processing center. So if you have someone that starts a lot of sentences with, I feel like, and then a really quick way to get them to switch, like flip that switch in their head, is change the processing center. So instead of saying, "Hey Daniela, how do you feel about this? Like what's your gut instinct on this?" To get a more holistic view of how you're looking at something, I'm going to ask you how you're thinking about it as well. And the other point that I want to throw in here is I think it's really important to note that like logic outwardly gets valued over everything else, but that
Yeah.
only applies to 3 of the numbers on the Enneagram. That only applies to a third. And that is reductive, in my opinion. Because there is validity that comes from listening to your heart. There is validity that comes from listening to your gut. And it doesn't mean that you don't have the intelligence to make good decisions. It just means that you have a different final check. You can still take logic in to see how it makes you feel, in your heart or your gut, but it doesn't have to be the be all end all. And in fact, there's a lot of wisdom that comes from that emotion that will show up in any of the 3 processing centers.
So integration is a thing for, there's only 9 types, but what do you say about integration? Because I just learned this recently from you. I didn't even know that this was an Enneagram thing. So can you explain a little bit about integration and why that kind of counters the limitation argument?
I am actually going to turn this back around on you because I'm curious to know what about integration like really kind of lit that bulb for you.
Okay, so when you were talking about the assessment that we all took, or I say we all, whoever you had take, when you were going through your certification, um, you referenced that as like, okay, well, let me see how integrated you were at this time that you took this assessment. And I was like, what? What does that mean? And so essentially, what I took in from that is how much of each number you kind of like internalize. Is that the right? Like, I guess how much of all of the Enneagram you make up, instead of are you, like, tunnel focused into your one lane, or have you broadened your mind, is how I took it, I guess?
Yeah, I would say that's a good start to it for sure. I will say that when most people first start learning about this, they test at a very low level of integration, and that can feel like a slap in the face, like you're not a 3D person or something, and that's not it. It's more about how naturally are you able to access pieces of other numbers. So for me, as a 3, 5 is one of the numbers that has nothing to do with anything for me, which I mean it has it's neutral. In other words, it's not one of my wings where I can easily pull from one of those personality traits that come of their core motivation, and it's not one of my arrows of growth or disintegration either, but there's still value in picking up the traits of a 5, particularly because there's an overlap between wanting to be competent and wanting to have value. Um, and that can look like, instead of reading the Cliff Notes version of something, reading the whole book.
Yeah.
Really getting into the meat of it. And honestly, I would say that's something that I did when I was learning about the Enneagram, particularly through the entire arc of it. Because at first I just wanted to know about me. And then as I started learning it, that's how I ended up, getting into that book with all the post-it notes that I showed you earlier. Reading that deep dive really enriched my understanding of it. And I had a pretty good surface level grasp of it before. But researching it as though I were a 5 made a big difference. And it contributed to the way that I add value to others' lives, because now I literally do it professionally.
Yeah.
And it's something that I really enjoy doing, is helping others unlock it in that way. So the integration piece comes from pushing you outside of your Enneagram comfort zone. If you're used to doing things because you want to set yourself apart, like fours want to be significant, right? Then it would be very helpful to then tap into other things, tap into other numbers that you might not have access to. Fours, for example, could take notes from a 9 who want to have harmony. So there's kind of a tension between someone who wants to stand out and someone who wants to be harmonious, because one of those involves a spotlight and the other one involves staying away from the spotlight. So when is it appropriate to do that? When is it appropriate to take a step back and understand that you still have your individuality, even if you've got an entire room that you're trying to bring together? And that that's how you push on your growth edges. It really is. But it has to be a conscious decision, because that's the whole point. You come back to whatever your core type is naturally, and some of the traits of your wings, I would say, certainly, but it has to be an active choice. And that's a big part of using the Enneagram as a tool, is understanding that you're reflecting on it, understanding what parts of your personality are affected by it, and then understanding where you're letting your personality kind of cloud the essence of who you are. Because the more you get trapped in the personality traits of it, and, well, I'm a 3, so I must behave this way, the more you lose the essence of who you are. So the purpose of integration is to kind of even the load out so that you can get to that essence more quickly.
I love that. Yeah, because I think, uh, and I did this too, when I first learned about the Enneagram, I was like, obviously I felt dragged and I was like, "Oh, of course I'm a 1, of course this makes sense." And then I learned that there were, and maybe this was back then, I don't see this as much anymore, but kind of like preconceived notions about each Enneagram type.
Mhm.
And so all the ones that I was reading about one, I was like, "Oh man, people already say this about me already." Now I'm like hated on 2 different platforms. So I'm like, "Damn it." But then I feel like I kind of leaned into, I'm a 1, I must be this way in every avenue. But I think that was just me trying to grasp, my type, and also trying to point out and see for myself how these things are playing out in my life. Um, but then also, gaining that language about all 9, if you dive into all 9 types instead of just your type, like you were saying, you kind of are able to pinpoint things and borrow from other numbers if you can trust think about it, like, holistically.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm in this moment where I need to be a little bit more brave, or maybe I need to be a little bit more, um, I don't know, considerate or something. I might try, and 2 is a wing, so maybe that was a bad example, but try and lean on, like, traits of a 2, or maybe I might try and lean on traits of an 8. So it makes sense to me that you would be like, "Okay, let me think about what my options are."
Yeah. And
Yeah.
no shame in leaning into your wings either. I mean, that's how birds propel themselves forward. Like,
True. That's very literal, and, what what do you say to people who maybe like myself, but on a more exaggerated level, don't like their Enneagram type and then decide to, like, put it away? Like, they're like, "Screw the Enneagram, this sucks."
I say, are you a 4?
Oh my god.
And the reason for that is because I do not know a single 4 who hasn't tried to retest and be something else. And it makes sense, right? Because they want to be an individual. They want to have significance, and you can't really have significance if other people, if you've been figured out, right? So anyway, there's always the encouragement there to read into your type and understand what resonates with you, and know that the test is not an end all be all. If you're reading through the types or listening through the types or just learning about the types in whichever medium makes sense to you, then pay attention to how you feel. Pay attention to where you feel really uncomfortable, because I guarantee you there's something in it for you there. And you're going to make a bunch of natural connections as you go through and understand each of the 9 types as well. Like, for me, it took me a long time to understand 7s for whatever reason. Like, it was very difficult for me to be like, what is it? What do they do again? Until I found someone in my life who was like the prototype of a 7, and I was able to attach it to this person. And then I was like, okay, all of that makes sense. And here's why. So there are certain pitfalls that you're going to fall into when you first learn about the Enneagram. One of them is typing other people. Listen, you're going to be curious. It's natural. I do it. I personally love typing fictional characters. However, you cannot tell other people what type they are, because only they can know that. And I think that's a mistake that every single person who ever comes in contact with the Enneagram does or makes. And I know that I've done that. I have a friend who he's a 9, And I argued with him forever saying, you're a 1, you're a 1, you're a 1. And the reason that I said it is because anytime we went to go grab food or anything at a strip mall, really, and the sidewalk was too far away, I would just walk through the planters and he would go, what are you doing? You can't do that. The sidewalks are there for a reason. And I was like, what? Who cares? Like, there's like bark here to walk on. Instead they anticipate this, and he's like, no, they're there for a reason. So it's like, you're such a rule follower, you're a 1. And he's like, no, I'm not, I'm a 9. And it makes sense because 1 is one of the available wings for 9, right? But I was just so convinced, and I kept telling him that over and over again, and that was one of the pitfalls that I fell into. And you probably will too.
I have. Yeah, I definitely have, and you supported me through it because I feel so bad, but I did this to one of my friends too. And for the same reason, I was like, you are painting this picture of this particular person, and this particular person, their core motivation I see as this. And then, they were arguing with me like, no, but I am this. And looking back on it, I'm like, who the fuck was I to be like, no, you're not. So yeah, I cringe, and I like think about that all the time because you really are the person who understands you the best.
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of leads me into this next avenue, which is, I feel like I don't ever really hear Enneagram practitioners or coaches or people, influencers talk about this enough, but introspection is kind of the prerequisite to the Enneagram. And this is why I was so hell bent on telling this person that they were wrong. Just so like, oh God. But because I felt like they were missing, like I didn't think that they were introspective enough at that time. So like me as a 1, I made a judgment. Who's surprised? But what do you say to people who maybe are not finding as easily, they're not finding the Enneagram to be as like accessible as a tool to someone who maybe isn't as familiar with introspection or avoids it?
This is the same reason why you shouldn't take the Enneagram test as a jumping off point when you are in crisis mode, because you're going to test differently. You can only really identify your type if you're willing to know yourself beyond the surface level. And I know that sounds weird because we're with ourselves 100% of the time, but there are some folks that it's scary for them to look beneath. And there are probably folks out there right now that are hearing this. They're like, I don't want to look at myself in the mirror that hard. That sounds awful. But you do become a lot stronger because of it. So yeah, you do have to know yourself well, and you have to be willing to go ahead and do the learning for it, because otherwise it's basically just a BuzzFeed quiz result. Like if you find out what number you are, what type you are, and then you use it as a shield to justify everything that you ever do, then it's not a tool. Then it's just trivia about yourself. So if you are let's say an 8, and you're like, well, I'm in charge because I'm an 8, so that's what it is, because 8s like to be in control of their own destiny. That's not going to go over so well. Like, you need to be able to figure out where you're exerting that control, where it might be advantageous for you to let go of that control. Why do you feel like other people are trying to take the control from you? Same thing for like a 6, let's say. And actually, I think it's especially important for 6s. 6s want to be secure. They want to know that they have security. And so 6s have a proclivity for sticking to what they know, I would say more so than most of the types. And of course, that's a broad generalization. It's not true of all 6s. But because safety is their number one motivator, it's going to be a lot harder to imagine doing things that you don't already do, because it's the devil you know versus the devil that you don't know. And so that introspection can feel like you're opening yourself up to vulnerability. Now, it's going to feel that way to everybody. You're going to feel like you're opening yourself up to vulnerability. But with a 6, it might be a lot harder because you don't know what's going to come in. It might be a bear. Who knows? You might say, I'm a 6, and then the bear comes in and is like, well, now all your worst dreams are coming true, and then the ceiling fan falls from the sky, and all these worst case scenarios that the 6s think of suddenly come to fruition. But that's not it, you have to be willing to do the work, just like all of the tools that we use in the Treehouse, right?
Yeah.
But I really like the accessibility of this one.
100%, because I think, you were saying earlier, like, it's a quick way to get accessible with these things, because to
Mhm.
me, Enneagram can be a jump point for shadow work.
Mhm.
And even what we're talking about, you find out that you're a 6 and you find out, okay, well, let's not even start there. You have to be super introspective in order to really fully resonate with the Enneagram and with your number, and to get into yourself the right way. Because I think there are people out there who have avoided introspection so much, avoid looking in the mirror, that they might not even be able to type themselves,
Mhm.
because they just are so avoidant at looking in that mirror. But that is where shadow work comes in. That
Yep.
is where, why am I having such a hard time with this? Why? So you start to break down those barriers. And once you get down there and you're like, okay, here I am sitting still, looking in the mirror. I see myself. I might be crying. I might be screaming, but I see it. So now let's figure out the Enneagram type. And then it is like a fast track a little bit through, okay, well, now I figured out what I'm trying to protect, what my core motivator is, what my superpower is, and
Mhm.
how all those things work together to create who you are. And then now you're making all these decisions based on what do you want to become. If you're someone who probably doesn't resonate with the Enneagram, even after all of this, then I would I still would challenge that. Like, yeah, there are other things too that we can talk about that maybe some people are turned off by the Enneagram because it has roots in theology. What do you say to people who are like, "Oh no, I'm putting this back down"?
There isn't any one certain religion that owns the Enneagram. It has roots in so many different places. And I think that the modern Enneagram has been adopted most vigorously by folks that practice Christianity and thinking like, this is how God made me. That's my understanding of it. But the point, like, no matter what, there's still a psychology element to it.
A
And a lot of
huge,
that
yeah.
comes from childhood wounds. So there's debate in the Enneagram community about nurture versus nature. And I think that the nature is more of the nature part of it is what will naturally sink in with you the most, right? And this is where I think that there might be overlap between astrology and the Enneagram. Um, because like you have a Virgo moon, for
Mhm.
example, and Virgos are known for being very meticulous. And so are ones, the
Mhm.
perfectionists. So the overlap there is like if that's what's written in your like cosmic blueprint, then of course it's going to land with you differently than it would land with me. Um so no, there isn't one certain anything that owns the Enneagram. The Enneagram is for everyone. And I think it's important to remember that because it is a way to get in touch with your spiritual self if that's the way that you want to use it. And especially when I'm talking about like essence, right? Like getting away from the personality of it to figure out who you truly are. I could see the argument in the world where you could substitute the word essence for highest self, for example, and getting in touch with who you are. But take it however is going to be helpful for you, right? And for some folks it is the psychological perspective, like There's a wounding childhood message that each one of the 9 types has heard at some point in their life, or at least taken it that way. So the one that comes immediately to mind for me is 9s often pick up the message when they're kids that it's not okay to take up space. And that could be for a variety of reasons, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you were raised in an abusive household. It could just be that you're like the middle sibling and your siblings on either side of you were particularly I don't know, gregarious, to use the same word twice in one podcast. But anyway, so they picked that up somewhere, you know, and I think it's important to remember that, like, no matter what resonates with you spiritually, psychologically, regular logically, there's an answer for it for you in the Enneagram, and it's not something where you have to sit around like bending the narrative. It's that simple. It plugs right in. It plugs right into just about any situation, because it does. It comes back to that one simple thing.
Yeah. I think, what I hate about that argument too, that it's overly simplistic. It's some things are really just that simple. Why are you trying to make it, you know, you yourself are the complex being. The tool that you're using is not.
Mhm. Exactly. And why would you want a tool to be complicated? Like, if I hand you 2 remotes because you're house sitting for me, are you going to want the one that turns the TV on, has the volume, and you can easily access like Netflix and Hulu and all that? Or are you going to want the one that's got a million different buttons on it and you have to hold it up at a certain angle and only when the moon is in, its balsamic stage?
Yeah. Yeah. And to kind of tie it into what you were saying before about ones, my brother-in-law is a one. And so like my husband's brother, and the two of us are very different. And it's funny
Mhm.
because I think about that a lot. Like we can both resonate and find meaning in this thing. It doesn't mean that we're going to apply it the same way because we're two individuals, and it doesn't mean that we're the same person.
No.
And just because you're a one doesn't mean that you're any number, doesn't mean you exhibit every single trait of that number. So the example I always bring up is that I'm chronically late. And that's not something that ones that's not something that's typically attached to the Enneagram 1. Normally they're like super on time or early. Unfortunately, I did not get that part of the message, but if you're saying those things and you're not getting it still, or you didn't dive deep enough, and I please invite you to dive a little deeper, because if especially for those that do value introspection and self-awareness, and do deep dive into spirituality, and maybe spend a lot of time thinking about who they are and who they want to become, if you're kind of devaluing Enneagram, or writing it off, take a second look.
Could not agree more. And to your point about the ones, and I'm going to spend a little time on this because this topic could be its own podcast. Every single one of the types has 3 available subtypes, and they basically stack like bangle bracelets. So where your core type is never going to change because you're always going to be defending or exemplifying the same core fear, same core motivation, and it's going to look different at different parts of your life. Your subtypes can kind of switch around. So with ones, what I think of is there are some ones who outwardly want other people to live by their values. There are some ones that go really hard on just themselves, and it can just manifest in totally different ways. Same thing with 3s, right? Like, I struggled a lot with being a 3 because I don't feel like I am someone that walks into a room and I'm like, look at how amazing I am, or else, and give me the trophy for everything. Because there are some things that I'm not naturally good at and it really bothers me, but I'll sink into the background about it. I'm not going to draw attention to myself, and I'm not going to necessarily like throw a fit if I can't do it. And those are the social threes. And then you've got like the 1-to-1 threes, SX, which I am, which means that I want to be the best at being a friend to you. I want to be the most valuable friend you've had. I want to have the best questions to ask you. That's where coaching really comes in for me too, where I want to be a really good value to you one-on-one and help you unlock all of these things that are really important about yourself. And that's where the superpower part comes in too, right? Because that's something I can more easily access. And then there's self-preservation threes too, which is like, performing well as a means of operating through the world, because that's what it takes for you to kind of have that safe feeling, similar to a 6. So if you want the remote that has a lot of different buttons on it, sure, dive into the subtypes. There's a lot of value in the subtypes, but it's still an advanced user kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings up another argument, I guess, that do we really stay the same number our entire lives?
Yes, there is no argument.
Yes. But people find that limiting, which is unfortunate. But again, it's just the first step. And so you're just taking the first step when you learn about this core piece of who you are. It doesn't mean that you're forever limited by this information.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it does look different. Like when I was a kid, during the 4th of July, I would assemble all of the kids on the street, and I was like, all right, we're going to put on a bike parade, and like it's going to be so great for all the parents. And that was when my social 3 was a lot more prevalent. But then as time went on and I realized that people would get upset with me for being outwardly wanting to be the best at things and wanting to kind of showboat, the more I was like, you know what, then I'm only going to make it show up for the people that I feel like deserve it. And there's still boundary setting that I have to do around that, right? Because I still want to be the best Lisa that I can be for other people as well as myself. But I don't put it out there as much as I used to. And that's because I learned a lot of lessons, some the hard way, some the subtle way about it. And that's going to be true for anyone, right? Like you're a growing being. You're going to learn different ways to approach the world. You're going to get feedback that you need to implement. And that's great. And that's how you integrate different things. But you can't ever change the little voice inside of you that says, Daniela, you can't be bad. You can't be evil. And that's good, because look how far it's gotten you. Look how far it's gotten you to stick to those values and be the woman that you are today.
Yeah. And to anyone who has tried to shapeshift, who has been through an issue where they're like, I need to negate this like core part of yourself. How did that work out?
Yeah. Probably not great.
Probably
didn't feel too true to yourself. There's probably a Disney Channel original movie about it.
Yeah, because it is really that, I don't know, I hate to say adolescent, but like these are things that we learn and they try to teach us early on, because of course we're going to try and mold into whatever it is that the people around us, or, the things that we want to be or attract, are trying to mold us into, but you don't need to. And that's the point. That is why I love Enneagram. You don't need to mold yourself into something different. You just need to understand who you are.
Yep. Understand and harness it. But that's kind of where the coaching of it comes in, because that's where I mean, as an Enneagram coach, what I can do is I can take a step back and see the full picture. Like you're putting together a puzzle. Whenever you're coaching, that's what you're doing. You're putting together a puzzle. So you've been staring at the same puzzle and probably the same 3 pieces because it's been up here like this in front of your face for however long. But as a coach, I can take a step back and say, actually, this little cluster that you're working on the bottom left, what if we tried that in the upper right? What would be different then? And then the picture starts to become clearer. But it's all bringing it back to, you know yourself better than I do. I can't type you. I can't tell you what to do. What I can do is ask you informed questions that help you expand your mind and help you understand where you've been limiting yourself. And a lot of the time it's totally subconscious. Most of the time people don't realize that they're the ones limiting themselves. And it's hard to figure out how you're limiting yourself, even if you have all the tools, because we're so zoomed in all the time. And I don't know that there's really a shortcut to avoiding that.
Right. Right. Which is exactly what you're saying, where an Enneagram coach comes in so perfectly to help. So,
Mhm.
like I said before, you already had coaching experience,
Mhm.
while you were kind of working on all these other things before you became officially Enneagram certified. So, what was the final straw in like getting you to finally put these pieces together?
They just fit. They just fit. I don't know. It's like I recognized early on that my style of coaching was understanding where folks were coming from. And my original philosophy was that people just want to be seen. And I feel like that's so core to what the Enneagram is that it just made sense for me. So I started experimenting with it. First, it was just with processing centers, like that hack that I told you about earlier with if you're hearing someone say, I think that, then switch it up and ask them how they feel about something instead. And then it got a lot more specialized. And I really like the process of getting to know somebody and hearing their story and the way that they approach problems. And then being able to hold that mirror up at them and say, what if this is because you're doing it this way? How would things change for you? And usually that can unlock some sort of door. And it can be a simple thing, right? But it doesn't mean like it's a simple thing, but it makes a big impact. And I've seen it make a big impact on so many of my clients who can like spot their pattern in their and stop it in its tracks because they now have the knowledge, they now have the vocabulary to understand what they're doing. So is it something where they're acting out of fear, whether it feels scary or not? Or is it something that is like fully intentional, that you're putting all of the thought behind and approaching it from all the angles that you have available to you?
Yeah, and that makes so much sense to me just on a a molecular level because it really is the foundation. You're talking about the foundation of who people are, and
Mhm.
and that foundation is everything. If you don't have the foundation, don't understand the foundation, and having that mirror, like coaching is so valuable for that because I mean even myself and talking to a coach and having someone reflect back to me what I was saying, I was able to hear, even though I heard myself say it out loud, I was able to hear how hard on myself I was being about something, and, like, I would never say that to another person, and so, like, that was so, I don't know, kind of revolutionary in that moment to hear because I was like, "Oh my god, why am I doing
Oh.
this to myself?" But it's so those elements just go so perfectly, and you are just the perfect person for it, in my opinion, because I know you and because you explain those things so well, but you really do excel in those one-to-one settings where if someone's coming to you with an issue, I'm speaking from personal experience, you're gonna help me kinda get to the bottom of it, and so your clients are so lucky to have you, I'm sure they tell you that, but, like, to reiterate, your coaching style is fantastic, and also the Enneagram is a fantastic tool, so it's a coupling of 2 just really great things.
Well, thank you, Daniela. And thank you to the clients that were there when I was first trying this stuff out, too. I mean, my current ones too, but I feel like you're benefiting from the ones that came before when I was taking a little bit longer to open those doors. So it's so cool to get to do this and make it my thing. You know, it's not just a hobby. It's something that I have seen firsthand change other people's lives. And it's painful stuff that I had to implement too to get to where I need to be. And I'm still learning it. I'm still implementing it. It's still this ongoing thing, but it gets easier as time goes on because it's easier to pick those patterns up. And that's, I mean, we're always iterating. We're always iterating, whether we mean to or not.
I mean, Lisa, who's giving Zoom lessons on the Enneagram, has come a long way.
Thank you for
I know.
this. This is a
Yeah,
lot of
thank
fun.
you. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us in the Treehouse today. If you enjoyed your time here, can you do us one little favor and send this episode over to someone else who might need to hear it? We love ratings, reviews, and recommendations. We appreciate you so much. Have a gorgeous day.